Moody Radio, Mornings with Brian here. You know, it's not an easy topic to discuss, but it's an important one. It's impacted my family a number of times, the issue of suicide. My maternal grandfather took his own life many years ago when I was in high school. We've had some friends, family friends do that. We just got back from Texas where some dear friends of ours, their oldest son took his own life at age 17. It's a challenge. And we know suicide rates have been high, especially during the pandemic. Dr. Steve Grcevich with us. Doc, there's a new report out, right, about statistics on this?
Well, the new report suggests that the suicide rate in the United States is at its highest point since 1941.
Since 1940? Was that when they started measuring it, or there's something about 41?
Well, I think that they started measuring these things probably back, 1920s, 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, give you like a specific date in terms of when they looked. But the thing that's kind of shocking is you think back to the situation in 1941, that you had, psychoanalysis was still fairly young, but like mental health treatment was something that very, very few people would ever access. We didn't have any effective medicine to help people. We didn't have cognitive behavioral therapy. It was kind of like, back in that day, it's like, suck it up and deal with it. And, despite the fact that, we have tens of thousands of mental health professionals now, that there are probably somewhere between 30 and 40 FDA approved medications, for example, to treat depression, the rate's no lower now than it was 80 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, and I often forget how new psychology is in many respects as an area of medicine, but that's disheartening for you to share. And that's true, right? I mean, we have so many resources available now, and yet the suicide rate is still high as when we had none. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that one of the ways of explaining it is that there are, that there are environmental and psychosocial factors that people are struggling with now that oftentimes become overwhelming. We think about this with kids that, when I was growing up, I went to an elite public high school, and 60% of the kids went away to college. Mm-hmm. But that meant that like 40% were going into the workforce, and there were opportunities for them. Like you think about it, like if you're a kid now and you're unable to be successful and do the things that you need to be able to do to jump through the hoops to get through school, for a lot of folks that seems pretty catastrophic because it closes the door to, a lot of opportunities in life. We start thinking about, the impact of, the lifestyle that we lead, the impact that all of these electronic devices are having in terms of how our brain works. One of the things I think that's a significant factor, and we talked about this, I think, a couple of segments ago, is the fact that 50% of the people in the United States identify as lonely, and that we're probably more socially isolated than we've ever been before. So that, even though you have medicine, even though you have mental health professionals, the external demands that people are dealing with in life, the day-to-day kinds of things that they struggle with, other, chronic conditions. One of the things that was interesting about the data that came out is that the two age groups that are most susceptible are 75 to 84 and 85 and up.
That shocked us as a team. We were like, wait, what? The highest rates are people 75 and older. Why is that?
Chronic pain, loneliness, people have lost a spouse, that they have, different medical conditions where they're suffering on a daily basis. And, one of the things that, we oftentimes struggle with in medicine is that people who have chronic conditions, especially chronic conditions associated with pain, have a difficult time, getting the kind of relief sometimes that they need. So you see people who self-medicate with substances. One of the theories is that there may be an overrepresentation of older men who've lost their spouses among like this group, that's older. The other thing that's interesting is that, while women as a whole have higher rates of depression and anxiety and mental health issues than men. 4 out of 5 suicides are men.
How do you explain that?
Um, Probably
Because that's incredible. 4 out of 5?
4 out of 5. I think that you can come up with a number of hypothetical explanations. One, that men are less likely to seek out help when they're having a problem. Oh. It's less culturally accepted among other men. There's some evidence when you start breaking down some of the recent data from the government that this is more common, for example, in rural, semi-rural, more isolated places than it is in cities. So that, access to mental health services in those places would be very different. One of the other issues is, access to guns or access to firearms. Out in the country, there are more people, who might have, hunting rifles sitting around, and that men are more likely to use significantly more lethal means when they try to kill themselves. So that men use guns, women take pills, and so that some of it is that the means of committing suicide is more survivable among women than it is with men.
And, as we jump back to the idea of the highest rates are in the elderly, essentially 75 and up. I don't know if folks 75 like hearing that word, but nonetheless, I think that's probably what it would be. I feel like I never hear about it. We hear about kids committing suicide all the time. I feel like that's a consistent storyline. Am I just not paying attention, or is it safe to say we don't hear about senior citizen suicide?
You don't think about a senior citizen having committed suicide, or you wouldn't be as likely to notice that if you were like reading obituaries in the newspaper. Because if somebody who's 80 years old dies, I think nobody blinks an eye.
They don't wonder what happened.
Yeah, when you see an obituary for someone who's 22 years old and doesn't mention a cause of death, the assumption that people go straight to is that it's either suicide or a drug overdose. And I do think it's important for us to take a look at those two issues hand in hand when we think about this notion of deaths of despair.
Yes.
So that in 2022, there were just short of 50,000 suicides. But the most recent data shows that there were 107,000 people who died of drug overdoses. So if you think about those two numbers added together, you're talking about 150,000 people a year.
And, I'm not certain we're alarmed enough about what seniors are dealing with if their rates of suicide are so high. It's not that we shouldn't be concerned about kids. That's not true at all. We should be concerned about them. But it's alarming. Like it's as if this problem exists and no one seems to care. And that's melodramatic, Steve, but we were shocked to find out that the rates were so high in that age group.
Well, I don't know that it's that people don't seem to care, but when you think about like the amount of life lost, I think to a lot of people, it seems more tragic. When this is, when it's a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old who's going to miss out on 60, 65, 70 years of life, versus someone who has already lived their life. But again, I think that it's a manifestation of social isolation, hopelessness that we see more and more of nowadays. Again, folks don't feel necessarily that they have anything to live for or to look forward to. The future looks bleak. And I would think that we in the church would have something of great substance that produces great hope to be able to offer to these folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I wondered if that's somewhat what James meant when he talked about caring for widows and orphans in their distress. It really is. We can't neglect that particular thing. It's not just like giving them a meal. Like clearly mental health is something that we need to care for those who are aging and alone. It's 7:17. We're up against a break here. Our guest, Dr. Steve Grcevich, president of Key Ministry as well as a child psychiatrist in the Chagrin Falls area. When we come back from this break, we'll continue talking about the suicide rates and how we recently found out from some research that they're the highest they've been since the 1940s. What else is there to discuss on this, and how can Christians help? We'll talk more about that. In studio with us is Dr. Steve Grcevich, founder and president of Key Ministry and a local child psychiatrist. And we've been chatting about the sad statistic, finding out that suicide rates are the highest they've been since the 1940s, in spite of all the resources available. One of the things I wanted to chat with you about is Sarah and I have had the terrible privilege of walking through this situation with a number of different families and in our own lives. No one ever sees it coming. And when you analyze the situation with them of what happened with their loved one, like, there's no way they could have seen it coming.
Well, statistically, one of the things that we struggle with as a profession is that, even those of us who do this for a living who are trained are very, very poor predictors of when something like this is going to happen.
Really?
Well, because if you think about this, and again, I'm more familiar with the data in kids, but there have been studies that have shown that half of all the teenagers in the United States have at least fleeting thoughts about suicide. So that there are lots and lots of people who think about it. When you start taking a look at the statistics, while not everybody who commits suicide has depression, having depression puts you at significantly greater risk for suicide. But the vast preponderance of people who suffer from depression will never do that. So that,
isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So that it's still, when you think about the number of people who experience depression or suicidal thoughts, among that group, it's still a relatively infrequent event and difficult to predict.
So if I'm understanding you right, people even diagnosed with depression, the vast majority do not commit suicide. So that's not necessarily a warning sign, being depressed.
Well, that's right. You think about it, that there were 49,000 people who committed suicide last year, in the United States, and there are probably 25 million people who are being treated for depression.
And it's hard not to feel almost hopeless as a parent or just as a human, knowing that it's so hard to predict suicide. Like, what are some warning signs that we could watch for?
Well, if you were looking at warning signs, obviously people who've had, an abrupt change in mood, where they are exhibiting significant, hopelessness, people who are exhibiting, symptoms of depression, that would be a red flag. One of the things that when they went back and looked at these deaths, that appears to be a very significant factor is folks who have a mood problem and drink alcohol. In that one of the statistics I saw is that they, if you have, an alcohol use disorder and depression, your likelihood of killing yourself is 7 times greater than people who don't have the excessive alcohol use along with depression, probably because the alcohol for some people removes some of their inhibitions and would cause them to act more impulsively on their thoughts. When you start thinking about, people with chronic pain or some sort of a chronic medical illness, and that this is probably an explanation for a significant number of the folks 75 and up, that they have a medical problem, and the prospect of going through cancer treatment is worse, than in their minds than dying. It's the process that people go through to get there, and sort of the day-to-day discomfort and pain, perhaps with the older population, that makes that more likely.
And yet, as I mentioned to you off the air, I'm happy to share it on the air as well. Sometimes it's situational in nature as well, not necessarily just neurochemical. Like my grandfather was experiencing chronic pain, probably depressed, and yet he got caught by my parents not having paid taxes for a few years, and he was terribly ashamed by that. I think that tipped the scale for him in making that terrible decision.
Well, yeah, and this is something that we see with kids, that so oftentimes it's situational, and so that it would be, a breakup with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, some being bullied at school, some sort of interpersonal conflict. So that the one little bright piece in this survey and unfortunately it's likely to be a temporary phenomena, is that the suicide rates went down in kids and teenagers.
Huh.
And it was probably because that there were fewer kids in school together in the last 2 years because of COVID.
Hmm.
And, and because it's the interpersonal stuff that's oftentimes like the trigger in teenagers, or again, struggling in school or being bullied. And, a lot of the schools eased up on the academic demands during this time, and kids had less opportunity to be together to get into the situations that trigger it.
Well, I think the important capstone on our brief discussion on the increasing suicide rates today has to be something about what do you do if you're concerned. So, like, let's just say you're hearing from, whether it's we've got someone listening who's a parent of a child they're concerned about, may have some symptoms, or even if you're an adult and your elderly parent may have some signs. What do you do?
First off, if you're concerned about someone, make sure that all the guns are out of the house. And I have people tell me, "Well, they're locked away; they'll never find them." No, like literally out of the house, because again, 50%, 50% of suicides, the gun is the lethal means, and by far and away, it's the most lethal means.
And so you're saying even like, well, we've got trigger lock stock or we've got a safe. You're saying
No,
get them out of the
house. Get them out of the house would be the first thing. The second thing is if you know somebody who's struggling, at the very least, get them to like their primary care physician, to have them screened for some sort of depression or mental health issue. It can be very challenging, again, to be able to, to find access to mental health services. But most primary care physicians or primary care healthcare providers are trained and equipped and resourced and do different sorts of screening that they can identify people who are most at risk and get them connected to help. Everybody, knowing 988, which is, the National Mental Health Crisis Line, is probably as important as knowing 911.
Yeah, 988. If you haven't picked it up, 988. They're not going to send the police to your house if you call it. It's a suicide hotline where you can call and get help.
Absolutely. And because we have a lot of, church people who listen to your show, if I'm a pastor or an executive pastor on staff, I would want all of the frontline church staff, who are like the first point of contact for people, to be trained for how to deal with a mental health crisis. Because we do know, according to the most recent statistics, that people are more likely to contact their pastor with a mental health crisis than they are a psychiatrist if they have a mental health crisis. One other resource that I want to mention to folks, because my guess is that, again, that there are pastors, that there are, Christian counselors or biblical counselors listening this morning. One of our partner ministries, Pastor Brad Hafes, who launched Fresh Hope, it's a biblically based mental health support group model that's up and running in hundreds of churches around the country. They specifically have a group model. It's called, if you go to surviving2together.com, that they have a biblically based mental health support model for survivors of suicide. And so that because, if you look at the numbers, that there are a lot of folks in our churches who are dealing with the after effects of that.
And it's beyond devastating. It's almost indescribable.
Yeah, that I've thought, as a parent, that would be the worst thing that could ever happen to our family.
Oh, yeah. In fact, when we were visiting our friends in Texas, I can tell you, as we were leaving, just looking at the mother, a dear friend of ours, I don't think I've ever seen anyone so sad in my whole life. It's difficult to describe that measure of sadness. So we've got to be sure as churches we're caring for people who've been through this. It's not just the loss of the loved one. It's how they went. It's what happened when you discovered. It's all of it.
And it's the trauma that all of the survivors of that experience. So
all survivors.
One of the things I tell kids is that, that this is that having dealt with the aftermath of these situations, that's probably the most hurtful thing that you could ever do to the people that you most care about in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've got to be ready as churches to be just a safe haven, a place of healing and help.
Yeah. And so it's if you go to like Fresh Hope, and specifically survivingtogether.com, they have a biblically based mental health support model that has been demonstrated to be helpful to people who are survivors of suicide.
And of course, if you want to make sure you're being cautious about and helpful to and ministering to people in your congregation with any disabilities or mental health issues, Key Ministry is the place to go to. Go to keyministry.org. They've got lots of resources and help for you. Keyministry.org. Again, Dr. Steve Grcevich has been our friend from Key Ministry. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting a spotlight on this issue in the Christian community.
Yeah, it's so important. Thanks, Doc. We'll have you back soon.